next discussion is Leadership Matters, Capitalizing on Individual Assets for Constitutional Gains. Now, our next keynote is designed to explore how effective leadership is not just about guiding others, but also about recognizing and leveraging the unique strengths each person brings to the table. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us Dr. RoSusan Bartee, from Department Chair and Professor at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Bartee has over 20 years of experience in higher education as a faculty member, administrator, and has accreditation endeavors at the university and national policy arenas. Can we please have Dr. Bartee on stage?
Hello, global leaders. Hello, global leaders. Well, have you ever wondered how that you would capitalize on individual assets and for institutional gains? Is that something you've wondered before? Well, I am glad that you are here. Matters of leadership today affect us in all very different ways. And if we find ourselves responding differently, depending upon not only how we read, but how we internalize the same phrases about leadership matters, given a response as a period and the declarative or the imperative statement that we make, or the response as a question, when we might say, leadership matters, or an exclamation point, when we declare without a doubt that leadership matters. Our interpretive perspectives, they affect how we look at all of these headlines that are before us today. The headlines that read, as the future of the workforce, the talent shortage is real, global human capital trends, how to align your leadership team, and who you know building students' capital. What a range of interpretations or internalizations that leaders may find themselves. And depending upon if you approach it with a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point, affects how you will respond. So in many ways, much like the cartoon there, it causes for pause, for us to look at leadership as a subtle sense of an art. And when we look at leadership as an art, we can begin to see a very different perspective. If leadership is considered to be an art, is it that we create these minimums? A very top-down perspective, a bottom-up perspective, where you see that the whip here as shown? Or do we create leadership from a cash-based perspective or a goal-based perspective, where we see that the maximums are put into place? Or is it based simply on the rules that are contained for, by, and through having these constraints, leaving little room for the creativity or the ingenuity or the innovativeness that leads us to the kinds of outcomes that we need for a workforce in the 21st century? How do we envision a workforce for today's challenges? Well, Pierre Bourdieu, who's a French sociologist, he talks about this concept of capital with the 4 phrases of accumulated labor, which is something that's done over a period of time. He also brings to attention on a private basis, where it's something that's done on an individual basis, where this person practices or engages in some particular endeavor over a period of time. And it's over this period of time where this is the agent, he or she is the individual that's engaged in these kinds of practices. And then what happens? Once those practices become public, it becomes a matter of social energy. It becomes a matter of what we see as reified or living labor. In the end, that we begin to ask the question, is this perceived or is this real? Is this perceived or is it real? Well, when you're talking about the perception or the reality of things, we have to begin to look at it from a social capital perspective. What is social capital, you might ask? And I would say I'm pleased to respond. Social capital has to do with those networks, those forms of engagement and connectedness that each of us has. What is then? I call it the who's of the matter. The who's of the matter, who are we networked with? Who are we engaging with? Who are we connected to? Then we go to look at the human capital side of things. When human capital talks about the knowledge that's possessed, the skills that are possessed, the abilities and other characteristics that may be generated through task-based endeavors. And I refer to those as the what's of the matter. So why are the who's and the what's so important when we're talking about building a workforce for the 21st century? Well, there were two different studies that I will highlight today. One that was actually done on Facebook. And this study had to do with the types of social capital that affects certain kinds of outcomes. So does it matter who my friends are and whether or not I have particular kinds of experiences? So for example, if my friends are a number of doctors, am I more healthy because my friends are doctors? Or if my friends are wealthy, am I more wealthy because my friends are wealthy? The other part that this study did show was the focus on zip codes, and zip codes matter. Zip codes tells us things about where you live, the value of your house, the values that are around you in terms of property. All of those kinds of things matter. So this study looked at the zip codes of those who are friends on Facebook. Can you imagine that those who like all of your Facebook postings are those who are considered as your Facebook friend, that they are creating, or they are part of a larger database that researchers are looking at to answer these tough questions about how do we create a workforce that is working within the 21st century. So here's what the study found. When looking at the areas of cross-connectedness, network cohesiveness, and civic engagement. Well, what we find here from the cross-type connectedness is that individuals who are either at a higher income or lower income, they tend to swing more to the higher income side, meaning that they have aspirations. Those who are from the lower socioeconomic status have aspirations in which they are striving to have more economically. The other part that this study found is that friend groups are established. They are established early on and often. If you reflect on your upbringing, your earliest upbringing, you may think about the kinds of friends that you've had throughout the years. And you may even look at the kinds of friends that you have now, where according to this research, the kinds of friends that you had early on in terms of their economic background and their social connectedness are in many ways the kinds of friends that you have now, if you reflect on your friend groups. And so the picture here that's showing the little children there at the end, those kinds of relationships are very important, because those kinds of relationships go throughout different phases of your life, into middle age and then into your senior years. The other part that the study found showed about network cohesiveness. And so what network cohesiveness suggests is that I have a friend or two, and we have the shared interest. And so whenever there can be found two different friend groups, or two different persons within a group of friends, the likelihood of being able to influence them increases. And so all of this matters when we're talking about your civic engagement. I'm sure if you reflect on your own friends now, and the kinds of things that each of you is involved with, you will be reminded that yes, we are involved in similar kinds of activities. And so that's what social capital talks about. These types of interconnectedness, these types of engagement, these types of relationships that bind people together. But what's interesting too, I will say, about this notion of bonding, that there is a notion of bonding that occurs within a civic perspective and then one within a more community-oriented perspective. And so what I mean by that is that the one we're talking about, community-oriented, that's much more on the micro level and how people are interacting with one another. The one on the civic component is much more at the macro level and the kinds of policies and institutional changes that can occur by virtue of these relationships. That's the Facebook study. The other one has to do with human capital. Human capital and what it means in this regard. How does it look at the kinds of knowledge, skills, and organizational-based forms of capital that can be used to advance the growth of individuals? So this particular study here, it examined the human resource directors' perspectives, about 1,000 of them, where it focused on the relationships that the organization in which people work influence the further development of those skills. And what we see is that it utilized survey data that these individuals would complete about the kinds of opportunities, resources that were being offered at the respective organization. So what do we learn from here? We learn here that from a hypothesis number one perspective, that it showed that differentiated growth and integrated responses regarding the leadership development practices. And when we're referring to differentiation, we're talking about what is used for building interpersonal skills and what the organization does to build interpersonal skills. When we're looking at integrated, we are focusing on the relational events, the types of job rotations. So in many ways, what we call them as job-embedded practices. Those are integrated kinds of responses. So what did the study find? Well, the study found that there was more differentiation of the developmental practices, leadership developmental practices that were associated with human capital. But what also the study found here is that the larger determining factor had to do with the integrated experiences. Those hands-on experiences that can put people in those places where they are getting the kinds of experiences that they need in a hands-on, practical way. And so that is very critical when we're talking about how to move our workforce forward. That we have to have our workforce in those kinds of experiences where they are learning hands-on, day-to-day, what kinds of activities are needed to carry out the job. And in essence, there was a connection there in terms of the sales growth. The sales growth and opportunities went out the roof according to this study. The other part has to do with the organizational level and human capital, as serving as a mediating force for how to improve the overall outcomes. And what this study found, but there was partial support that this happened, that in essence, we know that our knowledge and skills base of our organizations are very important. But yet it was not a key determining factor. It did not override the importance of institutional culture. Institutional culture does matter. So now we've talked about the what's of human capital. And previously we talked about the who's of social capital. Let's take a look at how do we get there? How do we bring all of this together? I'm reminded of a quote by John S. Maxwell. And he talks about that anyone can steer the ship. Anyone can steer the ship, but it really takes a leader to chart the course. And so it becomes fundamentally important that we understand the mindset of the leader. Are you the mindset of a leader? Do you possess the mindset of the leader that is much more fixed? Or do you possess the mindset of a leader that is much more growth-oriented? That is the question, because that determines which side of the arrow we will find ourselves. Will we find ourselves in the green arrow that is much more growth-oriented? Or will we find ourselves in the down arrow that's much more fixed-oriented? All of those things compare and compel us to be able to look at what they mean for institutional and individual outcomes. So the question to each of you sitting here today, which are you? Are you half full? Are you half empty when it comes to leadership development? Whatever the case is, I challenge us all to move in the direction of capitalizing upwardly and fully. That is the direction that is important, that we move toward creating a 21st century workforce. Then the other part is, what is it that leaders must know and be able to do? What is it that leaders must know and be able to do? Leaders must know the people they are leading and the interests that they have in order to influence their institutional climate. What kinds of data are you collecting on your employees? What kinds of data do your companies that you work for collect on you? Those are very important, because not only are leaders leading the people that they are leading, they are also leading the people and their other interests. And that is why this kind of data is critically important for determining a workforce that can influence the climate of the workplace. The climate meaning the attitudes or the feeling of the temperature when you walk into that building. You automatically know what kind of setting that is when you enter the schools, when you enter the workplace, when you enter a home. Those kinds of things matter. What does it mean then for leaders to know for social capital? Now, it is human capital. What we need to know is that we have to do a better job of institutionalizing leadership development practices and be able to utilize those practices to either shape or reshape institutional culture. So once we have that kind of data that is there and present to us, how is it that it's being used? What other kinds of opportunities do we need to provide our workforce with being able to achieve the accomplishments that we are setting out to achieve? Because when we're talking about culture, we're talking about creating norms. We're talking about creating traditions. We're talking about creating institutions that last beyond the person in the position. It is about institutionalizing and systematizing the way in which we do business. That is how we change a culture. In closing, we know that social capital are the who's. It influences the institutional climate toward ensuring a more micro-level friendly context in terms of how we're able to relate with one another. The human capital deals with the what's, as it sustains the institution far beyond any of us. So we have to envision what we want for our respective places and then work to create what it is that we want. And lastly, I'm reminded of a story of my, at that time, he was around 4 years old nephew. He decided that he wanted to ride with me on a trip. And of course, being his aunt, his doting aunt, I was very excited. And once we got in the car and I was driving alone, his whole disposition changed. And of course, I thought it was because he was with me. But I came to later find out that he started to point at this map in my car. And that map was a GPS. He kept pointing and pointing to it. And then I said, oh, is that why you wanted to ride with me, because of my GPS? And he immediately started to laugh and say yes. So much for the doting on. But at that time, he was 40 years old, and now he's going to be an interim freshman at Texas A&M University in the fall. But even at that time, that 4-year-old knew that whether or not he was a Gen Xer, Y, or Z, or a millennial, baby boomer, or whomever, he wanted to be with somebody he felt like could follow directions. And that is what leadership is about. Being able to chart a course, provide the compass to go forward in order that we are able to achieve those goals that we set out for. And that is what is required for us to be able to accomplish those institutional and individual assets in a capitalizing manner. And so that is my message for today, and one in which I approve. Thank you so very much. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have.
First of all, absolutely, thank you for sharing the importance of leadership, such an incredible message. I know you're working in the educational side of it at the University of Florida. Definitely interested in your perspective about leadership being a fundamental course in the college course curriculum. I happen to teach leadership and project management whenever the universities want to, put a little something extra as extracurricular, right? But how can we, when we can think of the internship, right? That opportunity to get into the space, but just curious your thoughts about how do we, it may not be a major, right? But how can we ensure that every student is walking away with that fundamental course? I think it's even appropriate in high school, but definitely want to hear your thoughts.
Yes. Thank you so much for your comments, and I think you're exactly right that leadership needs to be integrated throughout our college course curriculum. In fact, I know that at the University of Central Florida, our College of Undergraduate Studies is doing something just like that, where a minor is being created, where students can have the opportunity to minor in leadership. And so not only is there an effort to institutionalize it from creating a minor, but there's also a recognition of the importance of it. Because whenever we can institutionalize something, that suggests that it is important to what we're seeking to do. And so wholeheartedly, fundamentally, every discipline should have a leadership course, because there's leadership in engineering, there's leadership in mathematics, there's leadership in biology, there is leadership all around us, because it's not only a skill, it's also an art that we saw previously on the slide. There is a discipline, there is a knowledge base, a science base, evidence-driven kinds of perspectives that leadership offers. And so what better way to promote leadership development holistically when we integrate it across the college curriculum? And so I agree that it's something that can be done, and who knows, maybe that's something that can spread across our globe given the importance of it.
Over the years, I seem to detect this attack on leadership from outside. The media, everybody's looking for someone to take down. We're always trying to take down a leader. Through social issues and social media, all that stuff you said with Facebook and all that kind of stuff. That data can be used for good and it can be used for harm. But a leader needs to stand up for his direction and the way he's steering the company and not be influenced by these things. But with lawsuits and social pressures and people that are willing to come after you because the landscape is so complex and leaders become vulnerable that they don't lead anymore. They don't stand their ground. They don't say, no, this company is about making profit and doing work for our shareholders. They will cower and they become weak leaders. And I just see that trend happening more and more and more. And I wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yes, you're exactly right. And you know, I think leadership is such a personal kind of endeavor. And each of us who steps into those shoes have to be willing to be attacked. Everything that we say, we have to be willing to have it scrutinized. Everything that we do, we have to be willing to have it questioned. It's not necessarily for the faint at heart. There's a level of thick-skinnedness that has to be in place. And so before we even walk into that role, we have to make the decision of ourselves, is that if I wear that color today, am I willing to have that color spread it all across the newspaper because someone thought I should not? Or if I accidentally misspoke, am I willing to see that in the headlines? Remember those headlines before? Am I willing to see that in the headlines, knowing that it was an honest and earnest mistake? And I have to sign up to that, whether I want to or not. But yet still, that's the downside of it. The upside of it, remember the half full, half empty perspectives? We have to look at the kinds of growth that we can have, the kinds of lives that we can affect, the kinds of differences that we can make in a child's life because we did accept the task. And when we understand that part of it, that then becomes our guiding force. That then becomes our compass. And no matter what the color is that I'm criticized on or the words that I misuse, that becomes secondary to that child who needed to meet me to make a difference in their life, to that adult who needed to meet each and every one of you to make a difference in his or her life. That, for me, is the approach to take. When those maximums become truly maximum, instead of allowing the minimums to become a maximum. That's the decision that we have to make, and that is the principle that we have to stand on. And from that, whatever the case, we will still be able to be successful. And as my mother often tells us, me and my brother both, and everyone who knows her as an educator in the community, she always says right will prevail. And so sometimes right is slow to prevail, no doubt. Right will prevail. And so when we have principled leadership, those kinds of things will come out. And when we see the results of the impact, by virtue of raising our hand and accepting the charge, it is all worth it. Other questions and comments?
Thank you for keynote. Actually, I have two comments. So one related to the perception of leadership. So leadership on its own cannot stand alone. You need to be a leader in something. So a leadership of a company is different than leadership related to religion. So leader in what? Yeah. So I believe that a base for your leadership has to be your skills and knowledge in that domain. So a financial leadership has to know finance. I expect that from him. A supply chain leader has to know supply chain very well so he can lead. And then after that comes some characteristic of leadership, like managing vision and purpose, like being able to motivate others. Unfortunately, nowadays, we focus only on the soft skills, which is managing vision and purpose, motivating others. But what about the technical base? You need to be good at what you're doing before you jump to be a leader. So this is one thing. Another thing, situational leadership. So I believe that there is no one style of leadership that can fit all the situations. You need to have different levels that you can operate in. So a leader at the time of crisis, your attitude is different at the time of ease. So these are my comments.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that's such a layered question. So what I'll start with is this. It's very important that we consider leadership as both an art and a skill. The skill base is that there is a knowledge, there's a body of work that informs us how leadership can occur. And situational leadership is one form of leadership. As we have democratic leadership, we have autocratic leadership, laissez-faire leadership. So there are different forms of leadership. It's important for us to know where we are within that basis. It is key that we have the content understanding. So when we are leading a religious organization, a Fortune 500 company, a university, whatever the case is, we have a discipline that is specific to the knowledge of that arena. So there's a discipline for me in educational leadership, is which I study, in cultural and social capital. So I know my discipline. And then there are disciplines for others who are in their respective role. But the leadership component is something different because it requires a different kind of skill set. Oftentimes the argument is that our IQ will get us there, get us into these positions, but it's our EQ, the emotional quotient, the emotional intelligence that helps us to deal with more of the art form of leadership, the how-to. The skill set is the what of leadership. The art form is the how-to. How do I interact with you? How do I gauge the situation? How do I respond to people on a day-to-day basis? So all of that is critically important. But I will submit to you that quality, effective leadership is quality and effective leadership irrespective of the context. So these principles are not unique to a particular context. These principles they're transferable to any context without any consideration of who is leading. They are tried, tested, and true. We're talking about being able to cast a vision, communicate well, have people in the right places on the right bus, there's people in the right seats in the right bus, as we know, to a Good to Great book by Jim Collins. So that's very important. And it is critical that as a leader, we have both of those kinds of perspectives, both the skill-based perspective as well as the arts-based perspectives, and that helps us to generate the effectiveness of leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bartee, for your invaluable insights and our very interesting presentation. That was great.